Welcome, everybody, to our second edition of Boosting Your Relationship. We are very excited to be here, Simon and Maren again, your relationship coaches. And today we're going to be talking about empathy. And why is that important? Because we believe that empathy is way better than trying to fix a problem or fix the other person. What do you think, Simon?
Yeah. And just so you guys know, I'm in Indiana, Martin's in Minneapolis, so we're doing this together still. Um, but it's interesting, right? Guys, we're pretty good at fixing stuff. The problem is we're really bad at relating to somebody in the midst of that experience. And so we move into task orientation. When we move into task orientation, we actually forget about the relationship part. And when we forget about the relationship part, then that actually leads to disconnection rather than a connection.
Yeah. Yep, that's a really good point. I'm going to put down the chat here. We don't need that on there. All right. Let's start talking about empathy, the 5 components of empathy, and then we can talk more on the dynamics on how that can show up, how that can be helpful, how we can pivot into that path of empathy. Just curious, Simon, do you know what those 5 components are?
I knew you were going to put me on the spot. That was not very nice of you. But I will see what I can find,
Oh,
right?
Google it.
Um,
Okay.
so empathy is one of the components actually of emotional intelligence as well. And so when we think about empathy, it's got a lot of benefits. And when we think about that, I want you to think about maybe the last time you were really hurt. And when you were really hurt, and somebody didn't respond in a way that nurtured that relationship or felt like you were heard or valued for your experience and just kind of moved into, hey, we're going to fix it. Think about how you felt. And so when we think about empathy, it's different from sympathy, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But it's really about understanding that empathy starts with ourself, but it also has a significant impact on how we interact with people. And so there's a couple of components here, and Martin's going to share those with us.
All right. These 5 steps come from the research of Brene Brown. And at least for my brain, being detailed and sequential, it's really, really helpful to think we can learn how to be more empathetic. And when we're in a situation, we can literally recall these steps in order to show up for that other person with compassion. So the first one is perspective taking. And basically that means that when I'm listening to someone else, I'm going to notice my own perspective, but also expand my thinking and be aware of their perspective. Simon and I think about things really differently. And I know a lot of our arguments happen because we held on to our own perspective.
Yeah,
Do you
when
have
we
any
think
thoughts
about
on
that
that?
perspective, yeah, when we think about that perspective taking, it really takes some self-awareness because what ends up happening is we can get really bought into our story of what's going on. And so it actually takes some effort to say, I'm going to pause. I'm going to actually listen and validate what somebody is saying, and I'm going to have it make sense to me from their perspective. Now that doesn't mean we have to agree with it, but we want to kind of get to a place of saying, from what you're sharing, that really makes sense to me. And that making sense is that validation, which then allows us to move into that empathy place, which says, what are you feeling as a result of that experience? So think about, again, these situations that maybe you've been in where, you're hurt, you're maybe frustrated, and you're just moving into the fixes rather than what is the actual experience you're actually having and what are the meanings behind it, because those meanings actually have a lot of power and value in a relationship.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And one thing that I'm thinking about in perspective taking is this really signifies if we can be in empathy or if we're going to go down even a sympathy route, which is very different. Empathy is holding space to say, your perspective matters and I can hear your perspective. Doesn't even mean we have to understand it, but we can notice this person is in a different headspace than I am. But when we start doing, well, my perspective makes more sense, it's more important, like it's logical, and the other person's perspective is stupid, that can lead us down to that disconnect. And even sympathy can be like, well, I'm over here and you're over there with that crazy perspective. Even if we're trying to invite kindness, that disconnect is going to take us a different path.
So an example of that might be if Martin's really struggling with something and I just jump into, well, I'm really sorry you're going through that. So that's a sympathy response. And what that means is I'm actually disconnecting myself from what Lauren's experience is. Now, if I can be curious about the experience and what her perspective is, I can actually gain some connection, but also some understanding. I may not understand fully, but I can get some understanding. And I can tell you, as we've incorporated this to have this conversation differently, we're actually learning about each other. And when we learn about each other and we have different understandings, then I can actually be in a space of, I can imagine that really feeling kind of crappy for you. Now, again, it may not feel crappy for me, and that's okay. But we can join that experience of the other person and say, that makes sense to me.
And really, what you're talking about are the next couple steps of empathy. And once again, I'm detailed and sequential. Simon is a big picture person, so he's able to keep seeing how all these parts fit together. The next part of empathy is staying out of judgment. And as you were just listening to Simon, I could see that. I could feel that even as he was describing that, right? If we're stuck in our perspective, it is very easy to judge the other person's perspective. Like, you think that, I would never think that, or you're going to do that, I would never. So that judgment piece brings more division instead of the connection that hopefully we would want to go for.
Yeah. So again, if we go back to that sympathy response, right? Lauren's struggling, and I say, "Oh, I'm really sorry you're going through that." Then I've actually separated myself. What I haven't done is actually join Lauren in the experience that she's having to actually understand her experience and know that I don't have judgment. So if I'm in a sympathy place, well, I'm really sorry you're going through that. There's actually some judgment in that. And when we do judgment, then we're actually building in disconnection rather than connection.
Yep. So, number one is perspective taking, being aware of your own perspective and the other person's. Number two, staying out of judgment. And then number three is taking our best guess at identifying the emotion or the feeling that the other person is communicating. And Simon, mentioned a few minutes ago, like, oh, I can imagine that you're really struggling in this situation, as he was reflecting back. And I might go, no, I'm not struggling. I'm really sad. Or, yeah, I am struggling and I feel so angry about it. But here we're talking about an emotional component, identifying the feeling and naming that. And that is really helpful to continue to stay out of judgment and perspective taking, because we're not arguing about facts. And when we fix, sometimes we're just talking about this factual layer, but that doesn't cultivate connection and relationship.
If you guys haven't seen it, there's a YouTube video called "It's Not About the Nail." And I would recommend you look it up, because this actually talks a lot about these kinds of issues. Because again, as guys, we like facts, we like to fix, we want to solve the problem, and we do it from an intention of, I really want what's good for Mark, right, or good for the other person. But what we're actually missing in that is missing that there's actually an emotional component. Now, one of the things that I know for me, I had to learn how to name emotions, and that was hard for me, because I never really grew up in a setting that described emotions with different words. So sometimes just having an emotion chart where you can start seeing different emotional words can be super helpful to start identifying. And it's okay if you don't get it wrong, right? If you don't get the emotion that the other person is feeling, they have the opportunity to share that emotion. Just like Lauren said, if I'm saying she's frustrated and she's saying, well, I'm really sad, that kind of changes my story, right? So rather than being in a judgment place of saying, oh, wow, I can't imagine you're sad about that, or I can't imagine you're frustrated, I'm giving her space in the relationship to be able to say, this is what I'm actually feeling. And that feeling is not for us to determine if it's true or not true. It is what it is, and it is true for the person who's actually sharing that emotion. And it's super important to remember that our role here is not to interpret. Our role is to sit in an experience that the other person is having.
Yep. So number one, perspective taking. Number two, staying out of judgment. Number three, listening and identifying the emotion that you're hearing. And then number four is really where our wheels have to turn, and is kind of like where the rubber meets the road, is communicating a heart connection around the emotion. So that means somebody could share with me something that they're experiencing that I never experienced. It doesn't matter. If somebody's saying, I felt really afraid, all I need to do is tap into, oh, I know what it's like to feel afraid. Now I can make a heart connection. So we're talking about common humanity here. So if we're talking at an emotional level, we can make that connection, even if the circumstances don't resonate with us at all.
And to also say that again, our purpose here is to make the connection, right? It's not to fix, it's not to get it quote right. It's actually just to sit in a place with people. So think about that in your relationships at work or at home with your kids. You can do this with your kids. So you got maybe a 5-year-old who's really upset, and they don't have a lot of language around emotion, and that's okay. But an age appropriate way to approach that, say, is, so can you share with me what's inside of you? And kids are actually really good at sharing. And for the adult, we can say, wow, that sounds really hard. It sounds like you might be feeling. And then we actually name the emotion and say, I bet that's really hard for you. And that moment, when we identify that emotion for that kid, we're actually building an increased repertoire for the child to actually understand their own emotions. And I know for me, I didn't have that growing up. I don't know how many of you had that growing up, but I didn't. And so for me, I've had to kind of relearn what my emotions actually are. And so when we actually communicate, wow, that's hard. I can imagine you're feeling this. Is that what you're feeling? And if it's not, again, that's fine. And then let the other person, whether it's in the work environment, whether it's in the home environment. I'll just give a quick example. I actually met with somebody today at one of the places I work, and we were doing a 90-day review. And I actually used this. And I said, so tell me a little bit about what your experience is. Tell me what it's like with people you're working with. What's it like in terms of, and she was able to share some of the frustrations, most of it around tech. And some of you can probably identify with that. But being able to say, wow, I can imagine that's really hard. I know you're not used to that. And I know we're trying to kind of restructure and find some solutions for you. But I can imagine that's really hard and frustrating because I know that you really want to do a great job. So again, we're identifying that this person is going through something, and we as a manager or as a leader can actually even step into it in the work environment. And I can tell you that builds safety, builds trust, and it actually builds it reduces the amount of turnover and people leaving because they're like, this person gets me. And that's an important consideration for us, again, whether at work, whether at home, whether it's with a significant other, whether it's kids, whether it's with your siblings. All of those can be, you can use these tools in those settings.
Now, one thing that happens when we're hearing somebody's struggle or difficulty, or someone's bringing a lot of emotion in, we can get uncomfortable. Our anxiety can go up. And I think that's where fixing actually can come into play. Like, I'm feeling so uncomfortable and they're feeling so uncomfortable. If I just do something to fix it, we're both going to feel better. And
Right.
it makes sense as humans that we would do that. But at the same time, it's like we're just skipping over what the person shared and going to facts, going to problem solving, and skipping over that heart place. So, for
And what we're
example,
not,
oh,
oh,
go
go ahead.
ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
What I was thinking is if somebody's telling us, I know people get anxious, telling us something, people get anxious on, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say. And then we like fumble and say something like awkward or inappropriate or fixing. And instead of trying to say something that sounds perfect or is just the right thing, we can do something very simple. One thing that I like to do when I'm listening to clients or a friend is I literally put my hand on my heart and I go, "Ooh, I feel that with you." And I slow it down and I just put that pause in there, like, "I feel that with you." Or, "Ooh, my heart hurts with you in what you're sharing with me right now."
One of the things,
Another, yeah, go ahead.
one of the things that we have to sort of recognize is when we get uncomfortable, we're uncomfortable because we don't know what to do in that setting, right? We don't know what to do with those emotions. And these tools are really designed to say, guess what? You don't have to fix it. You can just sit with somebody in their emotion, and you know what? You're building a stronger relationship as a result of that. Now, that doesn't mean that don't come back at some point and try and co-create solutions. But in the moment, if you can meet them where they're at with their emotional state, it can be hugely important and impactful in the relationship you have with people.
And as you're sharing that, I'm thinking about another default as humans when we start feeling anxious or don't know what to say. Another one is we try to minimize or make it seem like, oh, it's not that big a deal. Like I know an easy thing for my brain to go to is, oh, but what about this? Oh, but, like my son's struggling. Oh, but your daughter's doing so great. Or like, oh, but look on the bright side. And once again, that often just feels like a miss to the person that's sharing instead of that connection and encouragement. It feels like just jumping over.
And don't you think, Martin, that when we do that, we're actually invalidating what the experience is for that individual, right? And so when we invalidate, then people don't feel safe. They don't feel safe to share. They're not going to share as much as a result of that as well. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, yeah. It's a lot of times people just shut down when that
Right.
happens, when they feel invalidated.
Yeah.
Yep. I had another example in my mind. I hope I can remember it, but it was about, oh, if you're struggling to know, like if somebody's sharing something and you feel that anxiety and you're struggling to know what to do, you could simply say something like, "Ooh, thank you for sharing that with me." And it is so simple, but it's really acknowledging their vulnerability, their trust in you, and it's acknowledging like, I can handle sitting and holding space for this difficult thing that you're sharing.
And so part of this is actually not only empathy for other people, but how do we have empathy for ourselves in the same place, right? Because again, if we're going to start recognizing and being aware of what we were feeling, we don't need to judge what we're feeling as right or wrong, good or bad. It just is. And we can just be in a moment with ourselves that says, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling frustrated, and naming it for what it is, not judging it, and then being able to actually say it to yourself or write it down or whatever it might be in a way that actually allows you to then process that emotion as well. What are some other thoughts, Martin, that you think about when we think about empathy for ourselves?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's really similar. And as you're sharing that, I'm thinking like, I think the more that we practice being present with our own feelings and emotions, the bigger capacity we're going to have to be present with others. So it's probably a direct correlation on how much discomfort or how much emotion can we tolerate. Building that up in relationship with ourselves increases our capacity to do that with others. And really, that
Yeah.
leads to
And
point.
I think that's a
A
really
little
important
delay.
piece. Yeah. I think that's a really important point is our capacity isn't going to be the same each day. And that's okay. Right? We can be okay with the fact that, today's a bad day for me and I have less capacity. Tomorrow may be a better day and I've got a little bit better capacity. But that's about not judging myself about my capacity like it should be a certain level all the time. And that's actually not realistic. And so to be honest with ourselves, now that doesn't mean we don't enter in a relationship, but it might say, I mean, there are times that I know Marna and I've said, I'm really tired. I don't know how much I can sit in this with you, but it really matters to me, right? So those kinds of discussions can start to continue to build, even if I don't have the capacity to do all the components that we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that really leads to point number 5, and that is staying mindful, being self-aware. And once again, the more we practice that awareness for ourselves, the more that we can stay grounded in that place in the midst of someone else sharing something that might be really difficult. So it's recognizing, like, I can make that emotional heart to heart connection, but there's still, this is me and that's them. There are still boundaries that basically keep each one of us safe. It's not like globbing onto each other and having to like go down that hole with the other person, but it's saying, I'm with you and I'm still maintaining my own integrity and my own sense of self.
And this is where we can stay out of that judgment and where we can stay out of that fixing, is when we have that self-awareness, we have the ability then to actually say, yep, that's really hard. And I'm here with you in it. I can imagine you're feeling a lot of things right now. And we don't have to say anything, but we can just internally say, I don't have to feel exactly what that person is feeling.
Mhm.
I can identify with it. I can imagine what it's like, and I can be present with somebody, but I don't have to own their emotion, which then if we own it, then we lead to fixing, right? That's actually what leads us to fixing. So if we can just say, wow, that's really hard. And I can imagine that is really difficult right now. That is a good way of putting that boundary up of saying, this is about your experience and I don't want to invade that experience other than what you've shared with me. And the fact that you've shared with me is a courageous step for the other person.
Yeah, yeah. If this is new to you and you're going to start practicing this, one way is you can set up the stage before you have the conversation. Like if I had something really important to share with Simon, I might say, "Hey, hun, I have something to share, and it's really important to me that you just listen. Like I'm inviting you to simply listen and be present with me. You don't have to solve anything that I'm going to tell you." And just put that freedom right up front so that I stay aware of that and I'm letting the other person be aware of kind of the expectation and what I'd really be hoping for.
So we're really hoping you'll try these things and these five components of empathy that can really help you have a different type of relationship with people around you. They're going to be surprised, and that's okay. It's going to feel awkward to begin with, and that's okay. And you may have a hard time identifying your own emotion, and that's okay. This is a practice that we're asking you to step into as part of your journey for relational competence.
Yeah, if you have any questions, of course, reach out to us, put it in the comments. We love to engage with this stuff. It's super exciting. And yeah, we say try it out and give us your feedback on what you experienced. So as we're wrapping up one more time, the 5 pieces of empathy are perspective taking, staying out of judgment, identifying the emotion, making a heart connection, and once again, that's being with instead of separating. And then the last one is staying self aware and being mindful. This is me. This is not me. Any final
So I
thoughts?
hope you, yeah, I was just gonna say, I think this is has been such an important part of our journey, I think, in terms of kind of getting to a different place. I'm a guy and guys like to fix and we like the facts. And we would have these discussions, quote, arguments about the facts rather than about the experience. And that the argument about the fact actually led to more and more disconnection. And when we switched it to say, I'm going to have my goal here is to try and sit in the perspective that Martin is having, it just changed everything for us. So I really hope you'll try this. I really hope you'll reach out to us if you have any questions or comments. We really want to hear from you. And we look forward to next week.
Yep. Join us again next week, Wednesday.
Take care, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.